There exists, in the dusty recesses of the Louisiana State Archives, a leather-bound ledger that no official catalog acknowledges and no researcher has ever been permitted to photograph. A volume so disturbing in its meticulous accounting that the archivists who first discovered it in 1987 debated whether to destroy it rather than allow its contents to enter the historical record. The ledger measures 14 inches by 11, its cover stained with something that analysis revealed to be a mixture of candle wax, human perspiration, and a trace compound consistent with tears shed upon its surface over many decades, and its pages contain entries spanning from 1831 to 1859, each written in the same elegant copperplate hand that never wavers, never hesitates, and never once betrays a moment of moral consideration regarding the transactions it records. Each entry follows an identical format, beginning with a date, proceeding to a physical description, continuing to a price paid and a price received, and concluding with two names, one marked as origin and one marked as destination, though these were not names of places but names of human beings, the first always a woman of African descent, and the second always a white family in cities as far-flung as Boston, Philadelphia, Richmond, and Charleston. The physical descriptions are what disturb readers most profoundly, for they read like the assessment notes of a livestock breeder discussing the coloring of horses or the markings of prized hounds, except they describe infants, children no more than 3 years old, cataloged according to the precise shade of their skin, using a color grading system apparently developed specifically for this enterprise, ranging from café au lait through cream, through ivory, through what the ledger's author termed pure milk, a designation reserved for those children whose appearance betrayed no visible evidence whatsoever of their African maternal ancestry. The prices reflected these gradations with nauseating precision. Children graded café au lait fetching between $400 and $600, while those deemed pure milk commanded sums as high as $3,000, a fortune in antebellum currency paid by white families who received not only a child but an elaborate fiction regarding its origins, typically involving a deceased cousin, a distant relative lost at sea, or an orphaned infant discovered in appropriately tragic circumstances. The mothers are never granted more than a single line, their names followed by a notation of their condition, usually returned to quarters or prepared for subsequent production, the word production appearing with such frequency throughout the ledger that its meaning becomes impossible to ignore or euphemize. The ledger was discovered behind a false wall in a Chartres Street townhouse during renovation work, and within 6 months of its discovery, 2 of the 3 historians who had examined it had requested reassignment to other projects, while the third, a professor of antebellum studies at Tulane University named Margaret Fontaine, had taken an indefinite leave of absence from which she never returned to academia. When interviewed by a graduate student researching the ledger's provenance in 2003, Dr. Fontaine, then 74 years old and living in a small apartment in Baton Rouge, spoke only briefly before asking that the interview conclude. She said that what the ledger revealed was not a crime or a business or even an atrocity in the conventional sense, but rather a mirror that showed what human beings were truly capable of when profit aligned with prejudice and when law provided not merely permission, but enthusiastic encouragement. She said she had traced 17 of the children listed in the ledger to their eventual fates, following paper trails through census records, marriage certificates, death notices, and family histories. And she had discovered that all 17 had lived their entire lives as white Americans, had married white spouses, had produced white children, and had died believing themselves to be what their documentation proclaimed them to be, never knowing that their first months of existence had been spent in the slave quarters of a New Orleans townhouse, nursed by mothers they would never remember and could never acknowledge, mothers who had been forced to produce them for precisely this purpose, and who had watched them carried away to lives of freedom purchased at the price of absolute erasure. Dr. Fontaine said the worst part was not the ledger itself, but the realization it forced upon her, the understanding that if 17 children from a single operation had vanished so completely into the white population, then the total number across all of New Orleans, across all of Louisiana, across all the decades of American slavery when such transactions were not only possible but profitable, must number in the thousands, perhaps the tens of thousands, and that somewhere in America today there walk descendants of those children who believe themselves to be purely white, who perhaps espouse ideologies of racial purity, who perhaps have never questioned the documents that establish their ancestry, and who carry in their blood the heritage of enslaved women whose very existence was erased to make the fiction possible. The graduate student asked if Dr. Fontaine believed the practice should be more widely known, and the old woman was silent for nearly a full minute before responding. She said that some histories demand to be told, and others demand to be understood before they can be told, and she was not certain that America, even now, possessed the capacity to understand what the ledger revealed about the foundations upon which its society was constructed, the terrible ingenuity of its cruelties, and the willingness of ordinary people to participate in transactions that transformed human beings into commodities so thoroughly that even their identities could be bought and sold and replaced with more convenient fictions. The story of what the ledger documented begins not with the ledger itself, but with the city in which such transactions became not merely possible but routine, a city unlike any other in North America, where the boundaries between races were simultaneously more rigidly enforced and more routinely violated than anywhere else on the continent. New Orleans in the early 19th century was a place of contradiction so profound that visitors often struggled to describe what they witnessed without resorting to terms more commonly applied to fever dreams or theatrical performances. A city where French, Spanish, American, and African cultures collided and merged and fought and coupled in ways that produced social arrangements found nowhere else in the nation. The Americans who flooded into the city after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 brought with them the rigid racial binaries of the Anglo-Saxon world, the sharp distinction between black and white that admitted no middle ground and recognized no intermediate categories. But they encountered in New Orleans a society that had developed over more than a century under French and Spanish rule, a society that acknowledged and even institutionalized mixtures their own culture insisted could not exist. The gens de couleur libres, the free people of color, occupied a position in New Orleans society that baffled and infuriated Anglo-American observers, for these were men and women of African descent who owned property, operated businesses, received educations, and in some cases owned slaves themselves. Their status determined not merely by the color of their skin, but by a complex calculus of ancestry, wealth, patronage, and social recognition that the Americans found simultaneously incomprehensible and threatening. More disturbing still to Anglo-American sensibilities was the system of plaçage, the formalized arrangement by which white men of means established relationships with women of color, relationships that occupied a legal and social space somewhere between marriage and concubinage, producing children who were neither fully legitimate nor fully illegitimate, neither slaves nor entirely free, and whose status depended upon the continuing favor and financial support of their white fathers. The quadroon balls that facilitated these arrangements became legendary and infamous in equal measure, gatherings at which young women of mixed ancestry carefully groomed and educated for precisely this purpose, were presented to white gentlemen seeking companions, their mothers negotiating the terms of these arrangements with the same attention to detail that other families brought to marriage contracts. It was within this system, this extraordinary collision of cultures and categories, that the enterprise documented in the Chartres Street Ledger found its origins and its opportunity. The Anglo-Americans who arrived in New Orleans after 1803 brought with them not only rigid racial categories, but the economic logic of the Cotton Kingdom, the understanding that enslaved human beings were property, and that property existed to generate profit, and they recognized in the mixed-race population of New Orleans a resource that their own system had never conceived, but that their own market was eager to purchase. The children of Plaçage, the offspring of quadroon mothers and white fathers, were often light-skinned enough to pass casual inspection as white, and while New Orleans society had developed categories and customs to accommodate their existence, the broader American South had no such accommodations and no tolerance for their presence. These children were neither one thing nor another, trapped in an intermediate status that offered neither the freedom of whiteness nor the terrible clarity of slavery, and the entrepreneurs who created the enterprise documented in the ledger recognized that this ambiguity represented not a problem, but an opportunity. If a child's appearance belied its ancestry, and if documentation could be manufactured to support an alternative origin, then that child could be sold not as a slave, but as a white orphan, commanding a price based not on its labor value, but on its value as a solution to a problem faced by countless wealthy families, the problem of childlessness, the problem of the heir who had died, the problem of the bloodline that seemed destined to end. The families who purchased these children were not, in most cases, knowingly buying human beings, for the transactions were structured as adoptions, as charitable rescues of orphaned infants, as family arrangements made necessary by tragic circumstances, and the prices paid were framed not as purchase prices, but as donations, contributions to the benevolent institutions that supposedly cared for such unfortunate children until suitable homes could be found. The fiction was elaborate, the documentation was convincing, and the children themselves were too young to contradict the stories told about their origins, stories they would eventually absorb and believe and pass on to their own children as family history, never knowing that their true mothers lived and died in bondage, never knowing that their very existence was the product of calculated breeding designed to produce commodities of a particularly valuable type. The townhouse on Chartres Street where the ledger was eventually discovered had been, between 1829 and 1861, the residence and business premises of a woman named Celestine Marchais, though this was not her birth name, and no record survives to indicate what she was called in the early years of her life before she appeared in New Orleans in 1827, already possessed of sufficient capital to purchase the property and begin the enterprise that would occupy the remainder of her active years. The few contemporary descriptions of Madame Marchais that survive in letters and diaries present a picture of a woman who would not have attracted attention on any street in the city, neither beautiful nor ugly, neither young nor old, neither fashionably dressed nor inappropriately attired, a woman whose most notable characteristic was her complete absence of notable characteristics, her ability to move through society without leaving a distinct impression in the memories of those who encountered her. She presented herself as a widow of French Creole ancestry, a woman of independent means whose late husband had left her comfortable but not wealthy, and who supplemented her income by operating a small boarding house that catered to respectable young ladies newly arrived in the city, providing them shelter and guidance until they could establish themselves in suitable positions or make appropriate marriages. The boarding house was real, its rooms occupied by a rotating cast of young women whose stories were precisely calibrated to explain their presence without inviting curiosity, and its operations provided a plausible cover for the comings and goings that a more observant neighbor might otherwise have questioned. The arrival of young women in advanced stages of pregnancy, the departure of those same women some weeks or months later, without the infants they had clearly been carrying, the occasional visits of wealthy gentlemen and fashionably dressed ladies who stayed only long enough to conclude some transaction before departing in hired carriages. The young women who arrived at Madame Marchais' establishment fell into two categories, though both served the purposes of her enterprise. The first were free women of color, usually the daughters or granddaughters of plissage arrangements, women who had grown up in the peculiar twilight of New Orleans mixed-race society and who found themselves pregnant by white men who had no intention of acknowledging the children they had fathered, women who faced the prospect of raising children whose existence would be a constant reminder of their degraded status, children who would inherit their mother's ambiguous position and all the limitations it entailed. For these women, Madame Marchais offered an alternative, a solution that was presented as a kindness, a way to ensure that their children would grow up not in the shadows of New Orleans, but in the full light of white society, would receive the educations and opportunities and respect that their appearance entitled them to claim, and that their ancestry would otherwise deny them. The mothers would receive a modest sum, enough to establish themselves in a new city where their history was not known, and they would carry with them the knowledge, offered as a comfort, that their children were thriving in homes where they were loved and valued and raised as the white children they appeared to be. Some of these women believed the story they were told, or persuaded themselves to believe it because the alternative was too painful to contemplate, and they departed New Orleans for Charleston or Savannah or Mobile, carrying their payments and their silences, beginning new lives built on the foundation of a loss they could never acknowledge or mourn. Others understood perfectly well what they were participating in, and understood equally well that they had no other options, that the alternative to surrendering their children to Madame Marchais was raising those children in poverty and precarity, watching them grow up to face the same limited choices, and that the transaction, however monstrous, offered their children something they could never provide, the chance to live as fully human in the eyes of a society that would never grant that status to anyone bearing the visible marks of African ancestry. The second category of women who passed through Madame Marchais' establishment were not free and were never offered the pretense of choice, and it is their presence in the ledger that transforms its contents from merely disturbing to genuinely horrifying, that reveals the full scope of the enterprise and the depth of calculation that drove it. These were enslaved women, purchased specifically for their appearance, their light complexions and European features, making them valuable not as field hands or domestic servants, but as breeding stock for the production of white-passing children, human beings acquired as investments in a manufacturing operation where the products were other human beings. The ledger contains records of 18 such purchases between 1831 and 1854, each woman described in terms that emphasize her suitability for the purpose intended, terms like excellent coloring or near-white appearance, or features entirely European in character, and each purchase price justified by calculations of future productivity, estimates of how many children each woman might be expected to produce over her remaining fertile years, and how much each of those children might be expected to fetch when sold into the white population. The fathers of these children are never named in the ledger, though the mechanics of their involvement are occasionally alluded to in terms so clinical that their meaning requires a moment to absorb. references to stud services contracted or arranged visitations, or the maintenance of productive arrangements. Language that reduces rape to a business transaction and erases the humanity of both the women subjected to it and the men who perpetrated it. Some entries suggest that the same white men returned repeatedly over periods of years. Their participation compensated not in money, but in access. The opportunity to use enslaved women's bodies in exchange for their contribution to the enterprise's productive capacity, while other entries indicate that Madame Marchais occasionally purchased the services of particular white men, selecting them based on their physical characteristics to ensure that the resulting children would bear the appearance necessary for successful sale into white society. The children produced by this operation were cared for in the early months of their lives with an attention that would have seemed almost maternal to an observer who did not understand its purpose, fed on the best available infant foods when their mother's milk proved insufficient, examined regularly by a physician whose name appears throughout the ledger in connection with notations about the children's health and development, and assessed at regular intervals according to the color grading system that determined their ultimate value. Those children whose appearance lightened sufficiently as they aged, whose skin took on the ivory or cream or pure milk tones that commanded the highest prices, were prepared for sale to white families, their documentation fabricated with impressive attention to detail, their origins rewritten to reflect stories of deceased parents and distant relatives and charitable rescues, their very identities erased and replaced with fictions more palatable to their purchasers. Those children whose appearance did not lighten sufficiently, whose complexions retained too much color, or whose features proved too obviously African as they developed, faced different fates recorded in the ledger with the same dispassionate precision. Some sold into the domestic slave market at reduced prices, others placed with free families of color through arrangements that served Madame Marchais' need to maintain relationships within that community, and a troubling number whose dispositions are recorded simply as removed from inventory without further explanation, a phrase whose implications become more disturbing the more frequently it appears, and the more closely one examines the ages of the children to whom it was applied, most of whom were under 1 year old when they ceased to be counted among the operation's productive assets. The buyers who purchased children from Madame Marchais's operation came from across the American South and beyond, from the Northeast and the Midwest, and occasionally from as far away as Europe, and the ledger's records suggest that they were not a unified category, but represented several distinct types of purchasers with correspondingly distinct motivations. The most common buyers were wealthy couples who had been unable to produce heirs of their own, families whose bloodlines were in danger of extinction and whose fortunes required children to inherit them, and for whom the acquisition of an infant through conventional adoption channels was either impossible due to the scarcity of available white orphans, or unacceptable due to concerns about the unknown ancestry of children obtained through official means. For these buyers, Madame Marchais' operation offered a solution that was simultaneously convenient and terrifying in its implications, for she could provide not merely an infant, but an infant with complete documentation, fabricated baptismal records and birth certificates and letters from fictitious relatives, an entire manufactured history that would withstand casual scrutiny and establish the child's claim to white identity in any court that might be called upon to examine it. These buyers paid premium prices for children graded pure milk, the infants whose appearance was most convincingly white, and they typically took extensive precautions to ensure that no connection could ever be traced between themselves and the New Orleans operation that had provided their heirs, collecting their purchases through intermediaries, traveling under assumed names, and maintaining their silence with a completeness that suggests they understood exactly what they were participating in, even if they preferred to conceal that understanding behind comfortable fictions about charitable rescues and distant relatives. A second category of buyers were men who had lost children to disease or accident, and who sought replacements whose appearance would allow them to maintain the fiction that nothing had changed, that the family was intact, that the heir still lived and would eventually inherit and continue the line. The ledger contains several entries that appear to fall into this category: purchases made with unusual haste and accompanied by extensive physical specifications, requests for children of particular ages with particular colorings and particular builds who could plausibly be presented as the lost children they were meant to replace, as though the fiction could be maintained by selecting a sufficiently convincing physical match. These transactions have a particular pathos to them, for they suggest a grief so overwhelming that it drove otherwise respectable people to participate in human trafficking rather than acknowledge the loss they had suffered. And they also suggest a cruelty so casual that it treated enslaved women's children as raw material for the fabrication of lies, as commodities whose only value lay in their ability to sustain the illusions of wealthy white families. The children sold in these transactions faced perhaps the strangest fates of any documented in the ledger, for they were not merely given false identities, but were expected to inhabit the identities of specific dead children, to answer to names that had belonged to others, to accept as their own histories that had been lived by those who came before them, and to maintain these impostures for the remainder of their lives, without ever knowing that the identities they inhabited were not their own. The third and most disturbing category of buyers were those whose interest in the children was not familial, but commercial, speculators in human flesh who recognized that white-passing children represented an opportunity for profit that extended far beyond simple adoption. The ledger contains entries that suggest certain children were purchased by intermediaries who intended to resell them at still higher prices to buyers whose identities were never recorded, transactions conducted at several removes from Madame Marche's operation to insulate all parties from the risks of exposure, and transactions whose purposes were left deliberately vague in ways that suggest the buyers and sellers alike preferred not to document exactly what was being arranged. Some of these entries appear to describe purchases by procurers for New Orleans's notorious brothels, establishments that catered to wealthy clients with particular tastes and that valued young people whose ambiguous status allowed them to be exploited without the protections that law afforded to white victims, while others suggest connections to similar establishments in other cities. A network of commerce in human bodies that extended across the South and beyond. Still other entries hint at purposes even darker, purchases made by individuals whose names appear nowhere else in the ledger, and whose payments were made in cash rather than the bank drafts and promissory notes that characterized most transactions. Individuals who collected children and disappeared with them into the anonymity that early 19th century America afforded to those with money and discretion. Individuals about whom the ledger records nothing except the amounts they paid and the grades of children they purchased, leaving subsequent readers to imagine what purposes might have motivated their participation. The operation documented in the ledger continued for nearly 3 decades, from the first recorded transaction in 1831 to the final entry in 1859, and throughout that period it appears to have operated with remarkable stability, neither expanding dramatically nor contracting significantly, maintaining a consistent production of approximately 15 to 20 children per year who were graded sufficiently white to be sold into the white population, while disposing of a roughly equal number who failed to meet the necessary standards through various other channels. The ledger's consistency suggests an enterprise that had found its market niche and was content to exploit it methodically, without the greed that might have led to overexpansion and exposure, and without the moral compunctions that might have led to voluntary cessation. Madame Marchais herself appears in the ledger primarily through her handwriting, the elegant copperplate that records each transaction with such disturbing precision, and through occasional entries that describe her own activities, journeys to other cities to establish relationships with buyers, negotiations with suppliers of the enslaved women who formed the operation's productive base, and consultations with the lawyers and physicians and forgers whose professional services were essential to the enterprise's continued function. She seems to have been a woman of considerable intelligence and organizational ability, qualities that, in another context, might have earned her recognition as a pioneering businesswoman, but that in this context only deepened the horror of what she accomplished, for they suggest a full awareness of the moral dimensions of her enterprise, combined with a complete indifference to those dimensions, a capacity to perceive exactly what she was doing and to continue doing it regardless. The Civil War brought the enterprise to an end, though not in the way that the destruction of slavery might be expected to have ended a business built on enslaved labor. The final entry in the ledger is dated March 14, 1859, more than 2 years before the firing on Fort Sumter, and it consists of only a few words written in handwriting that has become shaky and irregular, quite different from the steady copperplate of earlier entries, words that read simply "inventory transferred to successor" and "arrangements completed for continuity," followed by a signature that is barely legible but appears to be that of Celestine Marchais. What this entry means is unclear, though its implications are deeply troubling, for it suggests that Madame Marchais did not simply close her operation when age or illness forced her retirement, but instead passed it on to someone else, a successor whose identity is never recorded and whose activities are never documented, at least not in any ledger that has yet been discovered. The townhouse on Chartres Street was sold in 1861, its purchaser a cotton factor named Bernard Thibodeau, who used it as a residence for the next 40 years without apparently discovering the false wall behind which the ledger was concealed, and Celestine Marchais herself vanished from all records, leaving no death notice, no burial record, no estate inventory, and no indication whatsoever of what became of her in the final years or decades of her life. A disappearance so complete that it almost seems deliberate, as though she had arranged to erase herself from history with the same thoroughness she had employed in erasing the true identities of the children she had sold. The children themselves, the hundreds of human beings who passed through Madame Marchais' operation over nearly 3 decades, dispersed across America like seeds carried on the wind, taking root in families that believed them white, growing into adults who believed themselves white, and passing on to their descendants the genes of enslaved African women whose names and lives and sufferings were systematically erased to make the fiction of whiteness possible. Dr. Fontaine's research, conducted over 15 years before she abandoned academia, traced 17 of these children with certainty and identified another 31 with varying degrees of probability, and her findings revealed lives that were in many ways ordinary, lives of farmers and merchants and lawyers and doctors, lives of marriage and childbearing and church membership and civic participation, lives that would have attracted no notice whatsoever if not for the terrible secret concealed at their origins. Some of these children rose to positions of prominence in their communities, their white appearances opening doors that would have been slammed in the faces of their mothers, and they lived and died as respected members of the society that had purchased them, never knowing that their respectability was built on a foundation of suffering and erasure. Others struggled, their lives marked by failures and disappointments that cannot be traced to any particular cause, but that sometimes seem to carry a weight of inherited trauma, a darkness that descended on certain family lines and passed from generation to generation like a curse whose origin had been forgotten but whose effects persisted. Still others simply disappeared, their trails going cold in census records and church registries, their fates unknown and unknowable, lost to history as completely as their mothers had been lost. The ledger raises questions that cannot be answered, or that can be answered only with further questions. How many other operations like Madame Marche's existed in New Orleans, in Mobile, in Charleston, in the countless cities where the peculiar economics of slavery created incentives for precisely this kind of enterprise? How many children were sold into the white population across the decades of American slavery, their identities fabricated, their ancestries erased, their mothers' suffering denied and forgotten? How many Americans today carry in their blood the heritage of enslaved women, believing themselves to be purely white, perhaps even priding themselves on that supposed purity, never suspecting that the documents establishing their ancestry are fictions created to facilitate transactions in human flesh? The ledger offers no answers, only numbers and descriptions and prices. The cold accounting of an enterprise that treated human beings as inventory and human suffering as an acceptable cost of doing business, and the silence that surrounds it, the silence of the archives that barely acknowledge its existence and the historians who have chosen not to pursue its implications, suggests that some questions are too disturbing to ask and some answers too terrible to seek. The townhouse on Chartres Street still stands, though it has been divided into apartments and renovated beyond recognition, its current residents unaware of the history that unfolded within its walls, its false wall long since removed, and its secrets long since dispersed into the archives where they gather dust and resist examination. Tourists walk past it every day, drawn to the French Quarter by its atmosphere of elegant decay and its reputation for haunted histories. But no ghost tour stops at its door, and no historical marker identifies it as the site of an enterprise that may have shaped American society in ways that remain undiscovered and unacknowledged. The ledger itself remains in the Louisiana State Archives, uncatalogued and largely unexamined, available to researchers who know of its existence and are willing to navigate the bureaucratic obstacles that seem designed to discourage inquiry. And its pages continue to record, in that elegant, unchanging copperplate, the transactions that transformed human beings into commodities, and commodities into white Americans, the terrible alchemy of race and money that operated in the shadows of antebellum New Orleans, and that may still shape the society that emerged from those shadows. Somewhere in America, perhaps in your own family, there walks a descendant of those children, a person whose genetic heritage includes ancestors who were bought and sold and bred like livestock, whose true family history includes generations of enslaved women, whose bodies were exploited to produce children who could pass as white, and whose identity rests on a foundation of fabricated documents and deliberate erasures. The ledger makes this claim not as speculation but as mathematical certainty, for the numbers it records, extrapolated across the decades of the enterprise's operation and multiplied by the number of similar enterprises that must have existed, demand descendants numbering in the tens of thousands, perhaps the hundreds of thousands, scattered across the American population like fragments of a mirror that was shattered to conceal what it reflected. They live their lives unaware, these descendants, and perhaps their unawareness is a kindness, a mercy that spares them the knowledge of what was done to make their whiteness possible. But their unawareness does not change the truth, does not erase the suffering, does not restore the humanity that was denied to their ancestors or the identities that were stolen from them. The ledger remains, patient and precise, waiting to tell its story to those who are willing to hear it, and the story it tells is not one of distant history, but of present consequence, not one of sins long since forgiven, but of debts never acknowledged and never repaid. And its final page, where the last entry trails off into that shaky signature and those troubling words about succession and continuity, suggests that the story may not be over, that somewhere the work continues under other names and in other forms, that the terrible commerce in human identity that Madame Marchais documented was not ended, but only transformed, and that the children of that commerce walk among us still, their origins concealed, their ancestors forgotten, their very existence a monument to the human capacity for cruelty and the human determination to profit from it. The year 1859 passed into 1860, and 1860 into 1861, and the nation that had permitted such enterprises to flourish tore itself apart in a war whose causes included, somewhere far beneath the rhetoric of states' rights and tariffs and constitutional interpretation, the fundamental question of whether human beings could be property and whether their bodies could be used, as the bodies of those enslaved women had been used, as raw material for the production of profit. The war answered that question in blood, 4 years of slaughter that ended with the constitutional abolition of slavery and the promise of a new nation built on different foundations. But the ledger on Chartres Street had already recorded its final entry 2 years before the first shots were fired, and its story continued long after the last cannon fell silent, continued in the lives of the children who had been sold, and their children, and their children's children, continued in family Bibles that recorded fabricated genealogies, and in family graves that bore names disconnected from any traceable ancestry, continued in the determination of white America to maintain the fictions on which its identity depended, and to suppress the evidence that those fictions were built on foundations of suffering and exploitation. The enslaved women who had been the productive base of Madame Marchais's enterprise, the 18 women whose purchases are recorded in the ledger, and the unknown number of others who passed through the operation before record-keeping began, did not live to see the emancipation that might have restored their humanity in the eyes of the law, for the ledger records the dispositions of each of them with the same clinical precision it applies to all its entries, noting deaths and sales and transfers with no indication that these notations concerned human beings, rather than assets being depreciated or divested, and their fates remain largely unknown, their names recorded only in a document designed to catalog their economic value rather than acknowledge their human existence. The horror of the Chartres Street ledger lies not in any supernatural dimension, but in its relentless ordinariness, its demonstration that atrocity can be administered with the same attention to detail that a successful merchant brings to any enterprise, that human suffering can be cataloged and priced and optimized with no more moral compunction than a farmer brings to the management of livestock. The handwriting never wavers because there was no reason for it to waver, no crisis of conscience or moment of doubt strong enough to disturb the steady hand that recorded each transaction, and the system never failed because it was designed by people who understood exactly what they were doing and who had every incentive to maintain its smooth operation. The buyers who purchased children from the operation were not monsters in any conventional sense, but ordinary people facing ordinary problems, childlessness and inheritance, and social expectation, who discovered that solutions to those problems were available for purchase if one knew where to look and what to pay, and who chose to accept those solutions rather than live without them. The sellers who provided the enslaved women whose bodies made the enterprise possible were not unusual in their cruelty, but merely participants in a system that encouraged such participation, that rewarded it financially and protected it legally, that normalized the treatment of human beings as commodities to such an extent that the specific use to which these particular commodities were put seemed unremarkable compared to the broader institution in which it was embedded. And the children, the hundreds of children who passed through the operation and dispersed across America, were not unusual in their fates, but merely unusually well documented, for they represented not an aberration, but an extreme case of a practice that was common throughout the slave South, the practice of denying human beings their own identities and replacing those identities with fictions more convenient to those who held power over them. Every enslaved person was, in a sense, subjected to this same violence, their names changed, their families separated, their histories erased, their humanity denied, and the children sold as white by Madame Marche's operation differed only in the completeness of the erasure and the destination to which it led, not the slave markets of the South, but the white families of the North and South alike, not the cotton fields and sugar plantations, but the drawing rooms and counting houses where white identity opened doors that were closed to those who bore visible marks of African ancestry. The ledger documents this erasure with the precision of a business record because that is exactly what it was, a record of transactions that converted human beings from one category to another, that manufactured white children out of enslaved mothers and white fathers, and the systematic denial of everything that connected the children to their true origins, and its survival is at once an accident of history and an indictment of the systems that made such transactions not merely possible, but profitable. In the years since the ledger's discovery, various researchers have attempted to trace the descendants of the children it documents, to follow the threads of those fabricated genealogies forward through time and discover what became of the lines that originated in the slave quarters of Chartres Street. The results of these efforts have been fragmentary, complicated by the success of the original erasure and by the reluctance of contemporary families to acknowledge what the evidence suggests about their origins. But they have established beyond reasonable doubt that the children survived and reproduced, and that their descendants survive today, scattered across the American population in concentrations that cannot be determined because the very success of the erasure makes determination impossible. Some families have discovered evidence of their descent from these transactions, have uncovered documents or DNA results or family secrets that reveal the truth concealed beneath generations of fabricated history, and their responses have varied from acceptance to denial to active suppression, some choosing to acknowledge the suffering of their ancestors, and others choosing to maintain the fictions because the alternative seems too threatening to their sense of who they are. Most families, however, remain unaware, their members living their lives in complete ignorance of the history that connects them to the slave quarters of antebellum New Orleans, to mothers who were forced to bear children for sale, to a system of commerce in human identity that operated in the shadows and left only scattered records of its activities. The question that the ledger ultimately poses is not what happened in that townhouse on Chartres Street, but what we are to make of the society that made such happenings possible and that inherits their consequences. The children who were sold as white are gone now, their lives completed, their identities fixed in whatever form they ultimately took, and nothing can restore to them the knowledge of their true origins or the connection to the mothers from whom they were taken. The mothers who bore those children are gone as well, their lives of suffering completed in whatever anonymous deaths awaited them, and nothing can restore to them the children who were taken from them, or the acknowledgement of their humanity that was denied them by the system in which they were trapped. But the descendants remain, the countless unknowing inheritors of this history, and the question of what they should know and how they should respond remains open, unanswered by the ledger that documents the crimes committed against their ancestors, and unanswered by the society that would prefer to forget those crimes entirely. The final image that remains from the ledger is the image of the last page, where the handwriting that was once so steady has become trembling and uncertain, where the words speak of succession and continuity, where the signature that closes the record of nearly 30 years of commerce in human beings is barely legible. Somewhere the ledger implies the work continued, carried on by a successor whose identity was never recorded and whose activities left no trace. And somewhere the children of that continued work grew up as white Americans, never knowing the truth of their origins, never suspecting that their identities were products of an enterprise that treated their mother's suffering as an acceptable cost of doing business. The ledger tells us this without elaboration, in the same clinical language it uses throughout, and then it falls silent, offering no further guidance and no resolution to the questions it raises, leaving us alone with the knowledge of what was done and the uncertainty of what became of it. In the dusty recesses of archives across the South, there may be other ledgers, other records of other operations, other documentation of the systematic commerce in human identity that flourished in the shadows of American slavery. But if such records exist, they have not been found, or they have been found and suppressed, or they have been found and their finders have chosen not to pursue the implications. The Chartres Street Ledger remains unique in the completeness of its documentation and the clarity of its revelations, a single window into a trade that may have extended far beyond what its pages record, and its survival is perhaps the most disturbing element of its story, for it suggests that the original operators expected their records to survive and saw no reason to destroy evidence that might someday be used against them. They were confident, those entrepreneurs of human flesh, confident in the protection that the legal system afforded to their activities, and confident in the discretion of their customers and suppliers, and their confidence was apparently justified, for nearly a century and a half passed before the ledger's hiding place was discovered, and in that time the children it documented grew old and died, and were replaced by descendants who carried no memory of what had been done to produce them. The story ends, if it can be said to end, with those descendants, with the unknown number of Americans who walk through their lives unaware that they carry in their blood the heritage of enslaved women, that their family histories are fabrications designed to conceal crimes, that their very identities are the products of a commerce in human beings that operated in the shadows of a society that called itself free. They are not to blame for their ignorance, these descendants, and they are not responsible for the crimes committed by those who created them, but they are the inheritors of those crimes nonetheless, and the question of what that inheritance means remains unanswered, perhaps unanswerable, a weight that passes from generation to generation without acknowledgement, a secret that is kept not through active concealment, but through the erasure that was built into the original transaction, the erasure that converted enslaved children into white children and buried the truth so deeply that it could only be recovered through the accidental discovery of a ledger hidden behind a false wall in a townhouse on Chartres Street. The ledger waits in the Louisiana State Archives, uncatalogued and largely unexamined, its pages still recording in that elegant copper plate the transactions that made the present possible, and somewhere in America, in families that do not know they are connected to its contents, the descendants of its subjects live their lives in ignorance of what the ledger reveals. This is the inheritance of American slavery, not merely the inheritance of those whose ancestors were enslaved, but the inheritance of those whose ancestors purchased the products of enslavement, who bought white children manufactured from enslaved mothers and raised them in ignorance of their origins, who participated in a commerce that treated human identity as a commodity, and who passed on to their descendants not only their genes, but the lies that made those genes seem to belong to a different lineage entirely. The ledger documents this commerce with the precision of a business record because that is what it was, and the horror it evokes is not the horror of supernatural threat, but the horror of human choice, the horror of ordinary people making ordinary decisions that add up to an atrocity so complete that it erased not only lives, but the memory that those lives had ever existed. And in the end, the ledger offers no comfort and no closure, only the documentation of what was done and the silence that surrounds it, the silence of the archives and the silence of the families and the silence of the society that would prefer not to know what its past contains. The last page remains, with its trembling handwriting and its troubling words about succession and continuity, and the question it raises, the question of what became of the enterprise after Celestine Marché retired from its management, remains unanswered, perhaps unanswerable, a mystery that compounds the horror it conceals and that suggests in its very silence that some stories do not end, but only continue beyond the range of documentation, in the lives of descendants who do not know they are descendants, and in the society that prefers its ignorance to the knowledge that the ledger offers. Somewhere in America today, there walks a descendant of those children, and somewhere in America today, the truth waits to be discovered, and the ledger remains, patient and precise, the only witness to what was done in that townhouse on Chartres Street, and the only record of the children who were sold from its doors into lives of freedom purchased at the price of total erasure.